What's up, guys, and welcome back to Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about top water walking baits, or spooks as many people call them. And the spook is kind of the that is the brand name of the Zara spook, but it's the one that started it all. And when you think about top water walking baits, it is the one bait. What I've got in my hand here is a Berkley Jaywalker, and there are literally at this point hundreds of different walking baits out on the market, but they all do one job, and they do them very, very well, which is that walk the dog style action on top of the water. And there's nothing quite like when you're walking that bait back to the boat and a bass decides to absolutely destroy it. And it's one of the things about bass fishing that I think gets so many people hooked and keeps us coming back, is that topwater bite. And so in today's video, I want to talk about walking baits. And so what I did was I actually went on the internet and I just scoured the internet and scoured YouTube looking for the top questions about walking topwater baits. And I've compiled a list of the top 5 questions that people have about walking baits, and I'm going to answer those questions so that hopefully it helps you guys to get your questions answered, and it helps you to go out and confidently fish a topwater walking bait and to just catch a ton of fish on it. Because if you're anything like me, you love a good blow up, and we're all looking for the blow up, and that's what we want more of. All right, so let's get into this. Got a little list here. So question number 1 is, what is the key to getting the perfect walk the dog action out of your topwater bait? So the short answer is practice makes perfect. Literally just going out there, practicing with that bait, because all the baits are so drastically different. I mean, from a spook to a Jaywalker to a Mega Dog X by Mega Bass, back around to you know, any other bait that you can figure out that falls within that category of walking baits, they're all slightly different. They all do something a little bit different, you know. And one great example that I always like to give is like a Jaywalker versus a Lucky Craft Sammy. Both are walking style baits, but they're very different walking style baits. And what I mean by that is that, like, you know, the Jaywalker just is like a back and forth, those big kind of glides back and forth, hard 90-degree angles. Whereas the Sammy, it's more of this like sneaky S action. And so to get that bait to do what it needs to do, it's going to take just practicing the walk the dog style action to be able to effectively go and fish all of those baits, because they all are so very different. Now, the longer, I guess that was actually a very long short answer. The short long of it, the long short of it. Listen, there's no, anytime I say that I'm about to give you a short answer, it's never going to be a short answer. The more long answer would be, you know, like, what is a tip that I can give you about walk the dog, and something that you can effectively go out and have an actionable tip right now, and that is twitching your slack. And so what I mean by that is, like, when your bait is resting on the water, you don't want the line taut with the front of the bait. So you want there to be slack laying in that line, and you want to twitch that slack with your rod tip. So what I mean is, like, you know, if you've just got straight line and you've got like all your line reeled up and it's very tight against that bait, a lot of times when you pull that bait, it's just going to pull forward. It's never actually going to get up and walk. It's just going to kind of chug forward like you would chug a chug bug or chug a little popper or something like that. With the walking bait, you have a little bit of slack, and you actually want to pop that slack. And when you pop that slack, that's actually what helps to create that walk the dog and that walk back and forth action. And like I said, every bait is going to be a little bit different. One's going to want more slack, one's going to want less slack. You know, one's going to be a little bit more aggressive, one's going to be a little bit more subtle. But the general rule of thumb is pop that slack. Another general rule of thumb or tip that I can give you is, the further that you're away on the cast, the harder that you're actually going to have to work that bait and to pop that slack to get it to walk. And that's just because there's more distance in line between you and that bait. The further the distance, the more aggressive that you have to be with the uptake of that line and the movement of that line to actually get that bait to do what you want it to do. Whereas it gets closer, start to get a little bit more subtle with the action and with the twitching of that slack, so that you continue to walk that bait. Because the thing about topwater walking baits that is always fun is that oftentimes you can get bites all the way from the bank to the boat, and sometimes bass will follow that bait all the way to the boat. And so you want to make sure that you're able to walk the dog far away from you and close to you and every distance in between, and with a bunch of different types of baits. And a lot of that kind of goes back down to the first tip that I said, which is practice makes perfect. But then tip number 2 is pop that slack in front of that bait, and that's actually what will get it to walk the dog the best. All right, so question number 2 is, when is the best time of day and water condition to throw the walk-in bait? All right, so this is going to be another 2-part answer for you guys, because one part is like the simple rule of thumb. The second part is the more complex, kind of getting into the best times to actually throw those baits. So the general rule of thumb is low light conditions. So early in the morning until the sun gets up. So like, if the sun rises at like 5, probably about 9, 10 o'clock, you want to put that walking bait down, because a lot of the times those bass will have an early feeding window. They'll feed on top and then they'll want to go down and start feeding on the bottom and actually feed on something subsurface. And then later in the evening, both of those being those low light conditions. Low light conditions are the best for topwater, and that often has to do with the fact that bass orient themselves to sunlight in different ways, and they use sunlight to their advantage. In the book Knowing Bass, it talks a lot about like how bass feed and when bass actually feed, and a lot of it has to do when a bass feels as though that it has the advantage over the thing that it's trying to kill. And so a bass's eye is a lot more complex than the bait that they actually eat, and so a bass's eye actually works better in low light and in bright light, pretty much in all light conditions, where the bait fish's eyes don't. And so the bass can use low light conditions to its advantage to actually eat bait fish and eat things higher up in the water column and on top of the water. And so that's why we like to fish, as a general rule of thumb, fish our topwaters in low light conditions. Now the second part of this answer has more to do with like time of year. And so like, in the spring, early spring, in that like early pre-spawn phase, the earliest topwater bites that you're going to get on, I feel confident to throw a walking bait all day long. And the reason that I do is because oftentimes it has everything to do with the position of the sun in orientation to the earth, or the earth's orientation to the sun, because we go around the sun. You get what I'm saying? Literally, the earth is tilted away, further away from the sun in early spring and going into the fall, and obviously throughout the winter. And so the way that shadows lay on the water, the amount of light penetration, the amount of daylight makes it where those bass are a little bit more willing to eat topwater all day long. It's the same thing with the fall. You've heard about like fall topwater fishing and how there's this awesome fall topwater bite. And a lot of that has to do as we tilt away from the sun gets lower in the sky, the shadows start to get longer, the amount of day starts to shorten. Those bass that, normally would only feed early in the day or late in the evening, that bite will get prolonged all day long, and they'll be willing to eat a topwater all day long. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that you can confidently throw a topwater all day long certain times of the year, but then other times of the year it may be a very short bite window that topwater actually works, and you can go out and catch fish on it. And so that's kind of the general rule of thumb both ways when it comes to when to actually pick up a topwater and when to throw it. What's the best time of day to throw a topwater lure? All right. Question number 3, how do fish typically react to a walking bait versus a popper or a plopper style bait? So that's a very interesting question. I actually like that one a lot. So I think when we talk about walking baits, I think that is the perfect kind of middle ground between a popper, which is worked very slowly, very methodically, and a plopper, or like a buzz bait or some other style bait like that, that's moved very aggressively, that kind of really never stops moving, that a lot of the times the bass react to that because it's moving very quickly and you're trying to get them to lash out on it. I think that walking bait falls somewhere in between, and how they actually react to that bait is probably very similar to how they react to the other two baits, but I think a lot of the reaction has to do with temperament and with water temperature. And so, oftentimes when you're dealing with bass that seem a little bit more apprehensive, maybe they aren't super aggressive, they don't really want to feed up, but there's definitely a topwater bite there and you're trying to get those bass to react, or maybe bass that are bedding or something like that, that popper is going to be the key. It's a very slow, very subtle, very small, just that bloop, bloop. And those fish can just ease up, they grab it and they ease back down in the water and you catch them. Where when the plopper, you're talking about aggressive bass that are living in current, those fall time bass, those bass that their metabolism, they are optimized at the peak performance of their life at that moment. They are trying to kill everything that moves, and they will aggressively run down and hunt things and kill things super aggressively. And that's where that plopper comes into play. You know, it's just you're matching the temperament of that fish. Those super aggressive fish require a super aggressive action on a bait, and that's where that plopper falls in. Where with the walking bait, it's kind of like I said, it's that middle ground. When you've got aggressive fish that are wanting to eat up on top, that aren't being super finicky, that are more willing to eat a little bit something bigger, but they're also not really wanting to like hunt things and run things down. They're still wanting it to kind of hang over their head for a time, and they're wanting that time to kind of process what that is and to react to it. I think that that's where the walking bait kind of comes into play. Now, not to be said that those things won't interact interchangeably, because I've seen days when they eat a popper and a plopper and a walking bait the same across the board. One may be slightly better than the other, but just they're generally looking up and they're generally wanting to eat. And I think that that brings me into another kind of thought process behind how do they react to it. I think oftentimes we have to consider what are bass doing. There are times that bass are just instinctively looking up. They want to feed up, they want to look up, and a lot of that is kind of complex. It's a very nuanced, you know, question to get into, or, you know, kind of thing to dive into. But for the most part, my rule of thumb there is, are bass feeding on bait fish or feeding on something, and are they feeding up? And what I mean by that is that there are certain times of year, i.e. spring, fall, that shad will gather up shallow, that they're up near the surface, and the bass take full advantage of the fact that they're up near the surface. A bass instinctually wants to feed up. It wants to push those bait fish and corral those bait fish up to the surface, because they can't escape once they're there. You know, they don't grow wings and fly out of the water. And so the bass know that if they can push those bait fish up, that they can corral them up at top and they can eat them. And so if you have bass that's temperaments are temperaments that want to eat something moving, they want to eat something on top, and then they're actively eating things on top of the water, and they're pushing bait fish up and just actively doing that, that's the absolute best time, the optimal time to throw that topwater. Another instance that I'll talk about is pinch points. And what that is like the corner of a dock, the corner of a seawall, something where a bass knows that it's hidden and it knows that it can ambush and react to something. Oftentimes bass will react to topwaters in those locations because those bass are actively in a mode that they want to kill something, to react to something. And when that walking bait comes walking over their head, or any topwater for that matter, but in this case, that walking bait comes walking over their head, looking like an injured bait fish, looking something like it's easy to kill, it passes past that pinch point, that reactionary spot, that ambush point. They're going to react to it, and they're going to react to it violently because they're in that mode to kill. And so all of that being said, and kind of how I've answered this question is, a lot of the times a bass will react to a topwater based on kind of the mood that it's in or the temperament that it's in, and let those temperaments kind of help to drive in the picking of which bait is the best. But I think generally kind of the middle of the road bait to start with should be your walking bait, because it can be moved slowly or it can be moved fast. It all depends on how you want to fish it. I mean, we've all seen times when we just and take our time, and then we've seen those times when it's like chick. And one of those two styles will get those bass to bite, and it's kind of that perfect middle ground between the super fast plopper and the super slow popper, and, you know, the middle ground of being able to have that tool that does a little bit of both and get those fish to bite. So yeah, that's a little bit of a complex answer, a little bit of a nuanced answer, but I think that question, as good as it was, requires a little bit of a nuanced answer. All right, question number 4 is, what gear, rod, reel, line setup gives you the best control or helps you to use walking baits the best? All right, so we'll just break down my setup. We'll talk about why I fish this setup and why I have continued to fish this setup for really the past like 4 or 5 years now. So the rod that I use is actually an Abu Garcia Pro Series. This is the Justin Lucas Topwater Special. This is a 7.4 medium heavy moderate action rod. And I have to say, Justin Lucas in the designing of this rod absolutely killed it. And I tell him every time that I see him that his topwater rod is the only topwater rod that I use because it really is perfect in my opinion. So the reason that I think it's perfect is because it has everything that I'm looking for in a topwater rod. It has the backbone and the ability to throw those bigger topwaters. You know, this is near 1 ounce topwater. When we're throwing, you know, the big ploppers and the Chopo style baits, they're 1, you know, over an ounce. And then 2, even though it does have the ability to throw those bigger baits, I can still drop down and throw things like poppers and stuff like that on this rod effectively because of the way that it's actually designed. You know, it's got that more moderate action. It's a little bit more tippy, and so it allows me to effectively fish as big of bait as I want to fish and as small as bait as I want to fish while still having that moderate action. Now I go with that moderate action because most of your topwater baits, your walking baits included, have treble hooks. And anytime I'm fishing a treble hook, I want a more moderate action rod. The reason that I want that is because I want to be able to allow me to really drive treble hooks into fish's face versus ripping treble hooks. So when you talk about a treble hook, you know, you look at it, it's 3 little points. And on this one bait, you've got 9 smaller hooks that a fish has got to get into its mouth. And not only does it got to get it into its mouth, but it's got to get into its mouth after it's already crashed up on top of the water, like hit this thing with 0 regard, bloated up out of the water. And so you really got to allow those fish a chance to get that bait. And then once you start to set the hook into them, to not rip, because treble hooks have a tendency to rip through things versus driving into the things, just because of the nature of the smaller point, the smaller shank, just the overall design of a treble hook. And so that more moderate action rod allows you to really load into those fish, allow those fish to get that bait, and then to drive those treble hooks home, because you're going to load that rod up to a certain point, and then it's going to lock into that backbone. And so it allows you to drive, and then lock those hooks in. And then once those fish are next to the boat, they're jumping, they're carrying on, as they often do when you hook them on a topwater. It allows you to keep that fish hooked, because that softer action, that more delayed action in that rod is going to absorb a lot more of that shock of that fish coming up and tail walk them. Another reason that I really like this rod is, one thing about topwater fishing is a lot of people, when they get a blow up, they'll set the hook a little too early, or they'll just, you know, react and jerk that bait away from those fish. This more moderate action rod helps me to be a little bit slower, meaning just the rod itself loads slower, it reacts slower, and so it slows down the whole process of moving line and thus pulling the bait away from the fish. And so even if I overreact in some instances, like it's just a giant blow up and it kind of spooks me, this slower action of this rod is going to allow that bait to not move as far as fast, and maybe allow that fish to actually get a hold of that bait a little bit better, and then allow me to hook them and get them into the boat. Then the line that I use on all of my topwaters is 40-pound straight braid. I think with topwater fishing, I love braid. Number one, it floats on the top. Number 2, I think on really long cast, oftentimes like we make with these walking baits, whether we cast them over a point, cast them over a big flat, or whatever it is, that long cast in combination with the fact that we're using that more moderate action rod, it's already got a little bit of delay, it's not got as stiff of a backbone, and so when you're on a really long cast, the braid not having any stretch in it whatsoever allows you, even though you're fishing that little bit slower rod, to take up a line a little bit more. And when you do take up that line, and even if you don't take up enough and you still just barely get the pull that you need, braid having no stretch helps you to really drive those hooks in, get those hooks into those fish and get them into the boat. I rarely fish leaders. I've fished leaders in a couple instances where I'm fishing just silly clear water with topwaters, but for the most part, I'm a straight braid, straight 40-pound braid kind of guy with my topwater fishing, and it helps me to have consistency across the board as well. I'm not mixing up line size or mixing up line diameter from bait to bait to bait. I can go effectively from a walking bait to a plopping bait to a popping bait, and every category in between as far as topwater goes, and know consistently what my rod and line is going to do. And then the reel that I use is a Revo Rocket. You can use any high gear ratio reel that you want to. I really like the Rocket, and the reason I keep the Rocket on my topwater rod has a lot to do with plopping style baits. Like I said, I fish the plopping style baits as well as the walking style baits on this rod, and that high gear ratio, that 10 gear ratio reel in the Rocket allows me to effectively fish those plopping style baits just way more effectively without overworking them. With a simple reel handle turn just real slow, I can get a plopping style bait up on top of the water, get it going, doing what it needs to do, and catch fish effectively. And there's just no reason not to fish that same reel with walking style baits, because effectively the only thing that I need that reel to do is take up line. And then once I get a fish hooked to take up any line that fish may blow slack into your line, be able to catch up with those fish and set the hook effectively. And any high gear ratio reel will do. It's just, for me, if I'm going to have a setup that I fish multiple styles of topwaters on, I'm going to settle with the reel that helps me to fish them all, and I feel like the Rocket does that really, really well. And so that's my setup. There's a lot of different opinions about topwater setups out there, but that's the one that I use, and I feel like that I have the absolute best luck with, and not only for walking baits, but just categorically a bunch of different topwaters. All right, so question number 5, the final question is, why do some fish blow up and miss walking baits, and how can you improve up on your hookup ratio? So 2-part question, and it's a really fun question. So this is something that I learned from, I want to say it's in the book Knowing Bass as well, but I want to say that I learned it from Mark Sexton, which is one of the lead biologists over at Spirit Lake, which is Pure Fishing's kind of secret laboratory of mad scientistry that allows them to make really cool baits. And bass actually have like a blind spot. And what I mean by that is there is a point in a bass's kind of conversion with a topwater, or their attack of a topwater, where they actually lose sight of that topwater. And so I forgot the exact distance, but I want to say it's like 10 inches away. The bass actually totally lose sight of that bait. And from that point on, it's just essentially open their mouth and kill it the best that they possibly can, and hope that they hit it and that they get it in their mouth and they kill it. And so that is oftentimes why bass miss topwaters the way that they do. It has nothing to do with you or the way that you're walking the bait or something that you're doing. It's literally the fact that the bass just loses sight of the bait, and in that last like 10 inches, it's reckless abandon. Now, this process happens extremely fast. Like, I don't want you to think that there's like this moment and like the bass like comes swimming and there's like 5 minutes of 10 inches where they like or can't see it, and that's why they just totally whiff on it. But like when they're coming up and they come up under something fast, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll kind of position themselves and then whoosh, and they'll rush up and they'll hit it. And so there's a point, it's like they see, lose it, and then that's that last kind of like, I just got to get to it, I've got to kill it. And so just like us, I mean, like if you just rush into something really, really quick, oftentimes you're going to miss the mark ever so slightly. And when you're walking a bait and that bait is actively moving away from those fish, that ever so slight miss can turn into a huge miss. It's kind of like shooting a bow. You know, when you shoot a bow, just the slightest little movement of just dropping your arm after that arrow, before the arrow leaves the bow, can drop your shot 2 inches. And that's the difference between killing a deer and not. And so it's the same thing with a bass. It's just like those little misses turn into big misses when they totally go blind in that last moment of that kind of final attack. And so that's oftentimes why bass will miss topwaters. It has nothing to do with anything that you're doing wrong, and everything to do with just the way that the bass is set up. They lose that topwater on the approach, and they hit it with reckless abandon. Now, one way that you can improve hookups with a topwater and how you can help the bass in its inability to see in that last little bit there is just to keep on walking that topwater bait. I tell everybody, do not stop walking that bait until you feel the pressure of that fish. And then even when you feel the pressure of that fish, we're not over here freaking just whack like you do with a frog or a jig or some other bait like that. We're just simply reeling, walking. You start to feel that pressure and just reel up that slack and just lean into those fish, just like you would with a chatterbait or a crankbait or a jerkbait or something like that. And even if that bass pulls that bait underwater, oftentimes they'll hit it and they'll pull it underwater, or just the suction and the vortex of that fish going back under the water will pull that topwater under the water. Just keep moving it, because eventually that topwater is going to walk its way back up to the top and then start walking again. And oftentimes those bass, what they do is they'll hit that with reckless abandon. They'll miss it and they'll go down and they'll reposition. They'll get a look at it again, and then they'll come in for a secondary or even a tertiary or quadrary, fourth attack. Like, I've seen bass that will eat something 4 or 5 times before they actually get it, and all I did was just keep on walking it. And that is way easier said than done, and I've spent hours upon tens of hours, of probably not hundreds of hours, fishing topwater baits to get to the point where I don't like just freak out when they bite. But that has really helped me to put more fish in the boat, is just keep that bait walking, keep it moving. Even if they pull it under the water, just literally keep twitching it just as if though it's on top of the water. And oftentimes those bass will come back for that secondary attack, and they will absolutely crush it that second time, because they kind of got a set of data the first attack, and now they're ready for the second attack, and it's going to be a little bit more accurate than the last one was, and they'll get that bait into their mouth, and you'll get a fish hooked, and then you'll catch a topwater fish, and you'll be like me out there, a drug addict looking for more topwater bites, because I absolutely love them, and that's just topwater bass fishing. But yeah, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed this video, click this video, it's popping up right here.